Okay, so I'd like to welcome everyone back to our conference on expertise and the problem of trust. And I'd like to kick off the third panel for today, which is centered on the theme of professions and the media. So I'll introduce each speaker in turn, and then afterwards we can hear from the discussant. So our first speaker will be Paul Starr, who is professor of sociology and the Stewart Professor of Communications and Public Affairs at Princeton University. Professor Starr has written and edited numerous books and articles on a range of topics, including social theory, politics, and the sociology of knowledge, technology, and information. Most recently, he is the co-editor with Julian Zelizer of Defining the Age, Daniel Bell, His Time and Ours. And Professor Starr is also the author of The Social Transformation of American Medicine, which won both the Bancroft Prize for American History and the Pulitzer Prize for Nonfiction. Professor Starr.
Thank you, Tom, and congratulations to Gil and Tom for seeing this book through to publication. And thank you for inviting me to be part of this project. So I am going to do two things. I'm going to talk about the general theme of this conference about mistrust. And I'm going to fit into this also a discussion about the paper that I have in this volume, because I promised I would do two things. And as it's worked out, it's almost like you're going to get two for one. So the subject of trust and mistrust in experts inevitably raises the question of their authority. And 40 years ago, in the book that Tom mentioned, The Social Transformation of American Medicine, I drew a distinction between the social authority of physicians and the cultural authority of medicine. And by social authority, I meant the control of action through the giving of commands, such as a physician's recommendations to patients or instructions to nurses. And by cultural authority, I meant, I'm just going to quote the definition, the probability that particular definitions of reality and judgments of meaning and value will prevail as valid and true. That is, will be accepted and incorporated into people's understanding of the world and themselves. Now, the rise of professional authority in the late 19th and early 20th century brought about an immense transformation in the basis of both institutions and beliefs. In the first 2/3 of that book, Social Transformation, I tried to account for the historical rise of professional authority in American medicine, to explain how physicians capitalized on their growing authority by gaining control of the healthcare market and shaping the development of institutions that impinged on their work, such as hospitals, public health, and health insurance. Medical licensing, medical schools, membership in medical societies were all crucial in the creation and the drawing of boundaries between the legitimate profession and the unqualified. But by the time I was writing Social Transformation, there was already a challenge to professionalism in healthcare and other fields. You might even say a crisis of expertise. It was really kind of like the original crisis of expertise, at least in this recent history. And in what had happened, of course, in the 1960s and 1970s, is that physicians came under criticism and faced new demands from the women's movement, from the Black movement, from what was then called the gay rights movement, and from groups speaking on behalf of patients' rights and the rights of people with disabilities. And each of those movements challenged physicians, not only, and the whole medical system, not only about neglect of their needs, but also about the basis of professional knowledge itself. Challenges that, for example, forced the American Psychiatric Association to reverse its classification of homosexuality as a mental disorder. A second challenge to physicians' authority and autonomy at that time came from a different direction, from the emerging role of corporations in healthcare, as healthcare became an immense, profitable industry. And in the book's final chapter, The Coming of the Corporation, I anticipated the failure to create a more rational, publicly driven healthcare system would lead to greater corporate domination, which it has. What I didn't say then, though it became obvious later, was that the integration of healthcare into large-scale business would compound the problem of mistrust. Americans came to wonder whether medical decisions were being driven by the financial interests of insurers, HMOs, and large healthcare systems that regulated physicians' work. Now, this is all familiar to you. It happened a while ago, though it's still developing in new ways. But in addition to these two sources of mistrust, the challenge from the left and the challenge from the top, as it were, there is now a third source of mistrust, a challenge from the right. That challenge is closely connected to ideological politics and the culture wars that began to intensify in the 1990s and came to affect healthcare acutely during the COVID pandemic. So I'm going to come back to that third source of mistrust. But first, I want to turn to the paper that appears in this volume, The Post-Industrial Limits of Professionalization, which is organized around a comparative analysis of healthcare and high tech. And that comparison might allow us to think about the relationship between mistrust as it is developed in the context of healthcare and mistrust as it is developed in the case of the tech industry and tech expertise. So to explain the puzzle motivating this article, I go back to the view of the growing centrality of the professions that prevailed in sociology in the mid-20th century. For example, in the work of Talcott Parsons and Daniel Bell. They expected that the professions and post-industrial society would grow together. Instead, developments have blocked professionalization in some areas and extended it in others, raising the question, why have some fields seen little professionalization, even though they demand levels of expertise comparable to fields such as healthcare, where professional institutions have continued to expand? So the low professionalization of high tech is striking. As of 2021, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, only 12.9% of those in computer and mathematical occupations, that's the term BLS uses, had any kind of professional license, compared to 76.4% of those the BLS counts under healthcare practitioners and technical occupations. Now, occupational licensing has grown overall from about 5% of the workforce in the 1950s to roughly a quarter today. While not all of that involves professional occupations, the social and economic footprint of professionalization has continued to grow. But if there is a direct relationship between professionalization and post-industrialism, it ought to show up in the heart of the information economy, and that is not the case. So in the paper, I run through a series of hypotheses that may help explain divergence in professionalization between healthcare and high tech. I'm only going to mention really two that I think are the most relevant. So the first I call the entrenchment hypothesis. And I just have to mention here, I have a book from 2019 called Entrenchment. It has nothing to do with this subject, although I think it is intellectually related, but that book deals with systems of inheritance, slavery, constitutions, systems of taxation, central banks, a whole variety of things. It doesn't have to deal with this subject. But by the entrenchment hypothesis, I mean that as a result of earlier historical developments, professionalization may become entrenched in some fields of work. That is, institutionalized in a form that's extremely hard to reverse, but not in other fields. And then very directly in growth rates, according to those earlier patterns, as new occupational groups in a field imitate the established ones. And no field better illustrates this phenomenon than healthcare. After physicians established the template and succeeded spectacularly in raising their status and income, Other healthcare occupations sought to organize themselves along the same lines. Medical work and its technological basis have changed drastically, but the professional paradigm has continued to be expanded. New healthcare occupations mimic the structure of medical profession. Regulatory agencies then reinforce that pattern, which extends to specialties and subspecialties within occupations, each marking out its territory. With its pervasive scope of practice rules, healthcare has become a warren of exclusive jurisdictions. But the high-tech sector, online media, and other elements of the digital economy have resisted being carved up this way. Not only are the relevant occupations characterized by extremely low levels of licensure, they also don't have standard educational requirements, strong professional associations, or other occupationally based regulatory institutions. The low professionalization of high tech is also, in part, a case of institutional continuity. The occupations that have come together in the high tech sector were not highly professionalized as of the mid-20th century. Professional jurisdictions were never entrenched in engineering or media-related fields. But it's not only the force of the past that is operating here. Another factor has to do with the extent to which organizational flexibility and entrepreneurialism are prized. And in that respect, there's a tension between post-industrialism and professionalization that early theories of professionalism failed to anticipate. It turns out that there is more than one way to organize expertise, and dividing it into fixed jurisdictions is not necessarily functionally superior to more flexible approaches. Both of the leading perspectives on the professions in the 20th century failed to see the limits of their assumptions. The functionalist perspective mistakenly assumed that professionalism had singular advantages for the organization of expert work. The monopoly perspective underestimated the potential for the emergence of competing ideologies of entrepreneurial labor and collaborative enterprise that could serve as alternatives to professionalism. And perhaps most important, the older theories of the professions failed to anticipate how technology could evolve in ways that would erode professional autonomy and authority. Instead of being only an instrument used by professionals, technology also serves as an instrument to control them and to undermine them, to control them organizationally and to undermine their cultural authority. In the case of medicine, by making alternative health information freely and directly available to the public. Now, this is central to what we might think of as the third crisis of expertise, the crisis that arises with the multiplication of online sources of information and disinformation in a socially as well as politically polarized environment. I said earlier that while the first challenge to professional expertise came from the left, that is from progressive social movements, the 1960s and 70s, and the second from the top, that is from corporate business, the third wave of challenges is coming from the right, from the populist right, which may not seem entirely fair. Some challenges to expertise in tech come from the left, for example, regarding the racial consequences of some algorithms. But this is basically a continuation of stage one. And although some anti-vaxxers are on the left, they don't have institutional support there. What is new about the current challenges to expertise is the institutional support that has been coming from the right. Both medicine and tech have been swept into the widening gyre partisan conflict because they're both closely connected to power. In the case of medicine, that connection became clear to many people on the right during the COVID pandemic, and they reacted accordingly to public health measures that had not only scientific but governmental power behind them. In the case of tech, it became clear that social media companies and their algorithms shape the circulation of news and opinion regarding political figures, elections, and those on the right again reacted accordingly, given the predominance of liberal views among the highly educated in the United States. And here I just want to emphasize something that I don't think has come out in any of the prior discussions. But we have seen a shift, not just in the United States. There's also data, at least I know that on France and in Britain, that although those with top incomes, those with great wealth, continue on the whole support parties of the right rather than the left, the more highly educated have moved over time toward the parties of the left. And so it is not surprising that people on the right should be suspicious of those institutions in which the highly educated have the most power. And I think there is just simply no way to separate the conflict over expertise today from this political change that has come about in the politics of the professional classes. So mistrust of experts is just another facet of a world where many people alienated from liberal culture put trust in religious and partisan sources of information that are more consistent with their identities. Neither the professional institutions that still guard the gates to medical practice, nor the black box technological opacity insulating the tech world have the protective power they once did. Politics intrudes everywhere. The idea of using professional expertise to build national consensus will, I think, must, I think, eventually come back because no nation can succeed without it. But for the moment, expertise is under a cloud of suspicion. It's under a cloud of political suspicion. And I'm not sure the experts themselves can do much about it.
Thank you. Our second speaker is Frank Pasquale. Frank Pasquale is the Jeffrey D. Forcelli Professor of Law at Brooklyn Law School. And he has written on the topics of artificial intelligence and data governance, and on the various intersections between law, health, technology, and political economy. His most recent book is called New Laws of Robotics: Defending Human Expertise in the Age of AI. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tom and Gil, for the invitation today. It's a real honor to be part of this lineup of folks that I've learned so much from. I'm a little bit scarce these days just because there's a huge pileup of work, both in my advisory role on AI and also with respect to law school stuff. But I want to be sure to offer to send this paper and and to be follow up with anyone that's interested on what I'll be speaking about today and more, of course. So today my topic is how power and knowledge in policy evaluation, from managing budgets to analyzing scenarios. And our timing is really good for this conference because essentially my talk today, I mean, it is essentially building on the paper that I have submitted to the chapter I've submitted to this volume on democracy and expertise. But it's a further work that I'm going to be having in Law and Contemporary Problems later this year. It's on the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. And this is an office that has essentially done a lot of work to try to expertly determine whether a proposed regulation has benefits that are greater than its costs. And one of the things I find fascinating here is the role of experts in quantification, including economic experts, as sort of capturing almost the entirety of social science expertise, contributing to this type of determination as to whether benefits are greater than costs for a proposed regulation. And what I want to propose is that actually there is a diversity of different types of social science expertise, including many folks in this room, that should also have a voice in these types of determinations. And finally, I'll close with a challenge, which is that you have until June 6th, 2023, to comment on the proposed revisions to Circular A4 governing the Office of Management and Budget. And so therefore, if you want to sort of make a case for public sociology, public social science, et cetera, that would be able to help advise government officials with respect to the costs and benefits of a potential regulation and maybe widen our determinations there, you've got this golden opportunity for the next, I guess, 6 weeks. So I'll start with my presentation today. I will start with a story about quantification in a regulatory agency. And what I think is so fascinating is that, they may consult all manner of social science, but in the jurisdiction I'm going to look at in California, they must consult quantifiers of costs and benefits, or at least that's how they've interpreted their role. And I'm going to focus on actually privacy law, which is a little far afield from the usual cost benefit analysis. Usually we're talking about health, environmental, other issues like that. But I want to show how even the ideology of measuring costs and benefits has gone into privacy law and regulation, and the problems that causes and how we might solve them. So I'll start by introducing you to something called the California Access Rights as part of the California Consumer Protection Act and California Privacy Rights Act. These were passed in 2018 and 2020. At the statutory level, on the very high level of the statute, they basically give you rights to access your data from corporations. They also give you rights to, they have Californians' rights, I should say, not us. Or, well, maybe there's some Californians in the audience, but they give Californians' rights to access information. Of course, Tom is here. And of course, to give meaningful information about the logic involved in automated decision-making processes, okay? Now, as the California Privacy Protection Agency is interpreting these statutes, they've got to determine things like, how many days does a company have to respond to your request? In what format will they respond to your request? Do they need to have a dedicated website to respond to your request? And there's a whole cottage industry already of journalists that have made requests from companies like Amazon. They get back hundreds of files about how much information Amazon has about them, Google has about them, et cetera. But the question becomes, for California, how do we decide how much regulation and to impose on corporations to decide what they have to do, okay? Now, as they do that, as they propose this type of regulation, they have to do something called the Standardized Regulatory Impact Assessment on any quote unquote major regulation that's expected to exceed $50 million per year once fully implemented, okay? And this California statute authorizing this impact analysis, it requires methodologies for assessing and determining the benefits and costs of the proposed regulation, expressed in monetary terms to the extent feasible and appropriate. But it also notes the importance of assessing the value of non-monetary benefits, such as the increase in the openness and transparency of business and government, promotion of fairness or social equity, and other non-monetary benefits consistent with the statutory policy, okay? So this I find really interesting because the statute, as I've just related, is quite open-ended, right? It's saying do your quantification, but also realize some things can't be quantified. But if you look at the actual texts of documents that are done in response to statutes like these, they are often really overwhelmingly based on efforts to quantify what's going on in terms of costs and benefits. And so, for example, to give you some examples of, what went on here with respect to the consultants who evaluated proposed business practices for handling consumer requests, essentially what was going on is they were asked to assess the costs and benefits of requiring California businesses to impose or to add additional technology in order to provide responses to consumer requests and to do them in certain ways. I won't go into all the details of how they would have to do this, but they would have to assess this. And so the consultant said, look, there's a wide range of uncertainty here. And they spent many, many pages going through what could be the cost depending on which businesses had to do it, which businesses did do it, which didn't, et cetera. And they had an upper bound estimate of a cost where they said, well, if 75% of California businesses had to abide by this regulation, it would cost $547 million. But if only 15,000 do, the top, say 10% of firms or some smaller percentage of firms, that would only cost $15 million, okay? So they spend an enormous amount of time in this regulatory impact analysis statement. The bottom line is they spend an enormous amount of time giving a huge range of cost estimates for this very one particular regulation about businesses handling consumer requests for their data, okay? Then it comes down to benefits, and the benefits are just very briefly gone over, okay? So the benefits, they actually mentioned nothing in the relevant report on the benefits of, quote, establishing systems for businesses and service providers to respond to consumer requests. And then for record-keeping requirements for firms that buy, sell, or share the personal information of more than 4 million California consumers, they just said kind of briefly, well, consumers get increased transparency, and this benefit is not easily quantifiable, but the transparency requirements make it more likely consumers' requests will be fulfilled completely in a timely manner, right? So that's basically pretty minimalist, right? On the one hand, you have this very vivid characterization where at least you're going to be forcing $15 million of costs on California businesses. Maybe you're going to be forcing $547 million of costs on California businesses. What are the benefits? Well, maybe the statute is going to be administered in a more reliable way. Okay, this I think is problematic because it's, as I've noted in other work, it's a problem that essentially this type of regulatory impact analysis does not look at the full range of individual benefits from people knowing their data and from groups being able to collate other people's data. And to start with the individualistic one, there's work by Arbel and Shapira, which they call a defense of nudniks. And this is a Yiddish term about people that sort of complain and by their complaints help provide better standards for everyone, right? And basically, even if 99% of people, if they can access their data more efficiently, won't use it for much, there will be, according to Arbel and Shapira, people that really assert their rights, and then by asserting their rights, help all of us, right? The one person, say, who catches Amazon keeping data that maybe it shouldn't be keeping on them, then they may get a better result for all. There's also the idea of educating the public, as Cambridge Analytica shows, right? As people started learning about their data, made information requests. There is a submission by Renee Maheu and Jeff Oslos to the European Commission on the value of the GDPR, where they talk about numerous examples of workers getting together, getting their data, and then using that data in order to push for better policy. And also examples of stopping fraud or trying to figure out fraud. For example, they called the Dexia Bank case was one of them. Empowering civil society, building information infrastructure. All of these are potential outcomes of strong data protection laws, but they are not included in an articulate or fully, or even fully, or at all, really, in most of the literature that tries to assess, say, benefits of data protection. And I think this is a real issue where we have to have a richer consequentialism in these types of scenarios. And I'm going to introduce some of the law review literature that's pushed in that direction in order to get there. But part of what I would say here is that, with the fortunate thing is this is part of a broader rethinking of policy evaluation. So at the federal level, the Biden executive order, there's a Biden executive order called Modernizing Regulatory Review that came out on the first day of the Biden presidency, January 20th, 2021. And it ordered the director of the OMB to begin a process with the goal of reflecting new developments in scientific and economic understanding to fully account for regulatory benefits that are difficult or impossible to quantify. Okay, and this is culminated in, two years later, in proposed revisions to Circular A4, which are the ones now open for public comment until June 6th. So I gave you a California example because it's something I'm just very familiar with as a scholar of data protection. And so I felt like I was more comfortable assessing costs and benefits there. But at the federal level, it's all up for grabs in terms of the types of cost benefit analysis we're doing. I guess I shouldn't say it's all up for grabs. What I should say is like, this is one of the most important efforts to revise the standards that has been done, in decades. And so I think this is really, really important. And part of what they're looking at in their focus of their proposed revisions to Circular A4 are the distributional effects of cost benefit analysis, right? What if we have something where you have the costs in general are less than the benefits, but the costs are very concentrated on minoritized groups, right? This could be a real problem, and we really should watch out for that sort of thing. Discount rates, the treatment of uncertainty, quality, objectivity, transparency, and reproducibility of results. All of these are part of what they're re-examining now in the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. Now, I'm following Amy Sinden, who's a terrific scholar of cost-benefit analysis at Temple University. I think there are three categories here for directions they could go, right? One is, and they are formal cost-benefit analysis, informal cost-benefit analysis, and scenario analysis. And with respect to formal cost-benefit analysis, what they could try to do is to insist that we can find better ways of monetizing the benefits, of trying to, say, put a number on the value of, say, workers to data access so that they can organize better or make demands on, say, platform employers, et cetera. right? But I'm a little worried about formal cost benefit analysis because I think it's just going to be very hard for that discipline to move fast enough to recognize these benefits. The other approach that Sinden notes is informal cost benefit analysis, which is really emphasizing qualitative description of costs and benefits, rough comparisons of costs and benefits, which acknowledges the impossibility of full monetization and quantification. And finally, what Sinden has also written about in some of her work and that I'm trying to carry forward in my present work is the idea of scenario analysis, that you could actually look at different scenarios to deal with the possible uncertainty of costs and benefits. And that would involve narrative accounts characterized by the proposed policy and alternatives, which are particularly good at identifying improbable but highly impactful possibilities and unexpected consequences, right? So I feel like we're really at a crossroads here. And what I hope, and what I certainly hope to comment on to the OIRA by the June deadline, is that the scenario analysis, we really need to develop this just as much as we have developed, as CBA has been developed as a discipline. Scenario analysis and more narrative accounts of the costs and benefits, overall impact of regulation and forecast impact needs to be developed as a craft. And even if it's very burdensome to develop this craft of scenario analysis, it's necessary on intrinsic non-instrumental grounds because it provides more forms of insight than the quantitative, monetary, and relatively short-term views of CBA that are now used to guide policy evaluation. Now, of course, the CBA advocates may come back at me and say that I need to do a meta CBA of CBA versus scenario analysis, of cost benefit analysis versus scenario analysis. And these questions of expertise often become very meta. But I don't think they can foist onto challengers an obligation to perform a meta CBA of different methodological analyses. I think that that's just an unfair construction of burden of proof. But what I want to argue in conclusion is that the real value of scenario analysis compared to these highly quantified focuses on monetization of proposed benefits of regulation is that scenario analysis is commendable because it and cognate tools of policy evaluation, such as wargaming, other futures studies, et cetera, have identified risks and opportunities missed by CBA because they call on a much broader range of types of expertise for participation in policy evaluation. So part of what I'm saying here is that we have universities with many different departments that can help forecast, understand backwards and forwards in a way, the different consequences of different types of policies. And I think that it's sort of wrong for us to really focus so much on quantitative monetization of, say, benefits of regulation. We have to bring in other voices. So my final point would be that while CBA is subject to many of the same types of challenges leveled against scenario analysis, it has failed to match scenario analysis record and potential of including diverse expert voices from social sciences, humanities, and beyond to consider the long-term impact of both regulatory and deregulatory initiatives, given systematic unpredictability of key social dynamics and the many forms of insight we need to call upon to fully understand the past and future of policy changes. So with that, thank you.
Thank you so much. Our third paper is by Eleanor Townsley. Professor Townsley is the Andrew W. Mellon Professor of Sociology and the Nexus Track Chair for Journalism, Media, and Public Discourse at Mount Holyoke College. Her work focuses on the institutional contexts and the political consequences of intellectual life. And it's appeared in journals like the American Journal of Sociology, Theory and Society, and Gender and Society. She's also the co-author of Making Capitalism Without Capitalists, and more recently, The Space of Opinion, Media Intellectuals, and the Public Sphere. Thank you for joining us.
It looks like a pen. You have a clicker, it looks like a pen, and you click down. I gotcha. All right. Well, thank you very much for that, Tom, and thank you to Gil and to Tom. I'm very happy to be here today, and I'm really honored to have my paper in this collection and to be with the, and to hear so many wonderful things today. I also really want to thank Christian and everybody else for putting on such a seamless event and taking care of all of the details. So thank you. Thank you very much. So my contribution considers the erosion of traditional expertise in the context of increasingly complex media environments for social performance. And so as a way into this question, I want to offer the case of media meta-commentary, defined as a historically specific form of media criticism that uses the comparison of media formats and media texts as the basis for critical judgment. And I use the performance actually of TV host John Oliver and his show Last Week Tonight as an example, which is probably good because this is the last paper of the day. So to frame the talk, I offer two preliminary observations, and yep, it came up. The first is that cultural performances are central to expertise. If expertise links specialized knowledge with wider social concerns, connecting tools and expert communities, clients and institutional arrangements, as Gil says, then the cultural performances that create these links are at the heart of expertise and cannot be taken for granted. Now, to sort of think about this, I use Jeff Alexander's work on cultural pragmatics to suggest that there are multiple challenges to successful performances in complex post-ritual societies like the ones we live in, where elements of performance, collective representations, institutional contexts, actors, audiences, scripts, stage, mise en scène have become disembedded. It's hard to create authentic performances that come off, to use Goffman's terms. Second, the circular performances of experts and critics have always been mediated. Media, as we know, are central to modernity. Collective representations and values move through and as media, and they are the communicative institutions of modern publics. Media are an essential part of the story because they enable communication in diverse communities. They permit complex divisions of labor to occur, and because they provide the very infrastructure and symbolic resources that make large-scale public discourse possible in the first place. It follows then that if experts seek to claim authority in the public sphere, they need to master some level of media expertise. This increasingly means expertise in online socially networked spaces, and these are not super friendly spaces for traditional experts, including, by the way, traditional media experts like mainstream journalists. Why? Because, of course, as we've heard today, they're sites of criticism, diffusion, and deinstitutionalization, which have amplified the erosion of traditional expertise. The distinction between amateur and expert has flattened. Micro-communities decry the possibility of broadly based public narratives and collective representations at all. And all of these trends are connected with what we think of as audience fragmentation and public polarization. So in this context, I look at critical media performances, or rather what I call critical expert media performances, for insight into the dynamics of successful performances. One such innovation that leverages the opportunities of new media spaces is media meta-commentary, where media intellectuals, use expert knowledge of the media field to deauthorize the traditional performances of other journalistic, political, and cultural experts. To be sure, the recent rise of meta-commentary and news formats in the United States can be traced to the abolition of the fairness doctrine under the Reagan administration, but it has much deeper origins in the tradition of the independent cultural critic and satirist, the media critic and commentator, and of course, traditional journalism itself. To this, it adds an extraordinary awareness of the new media ecology and its social logics, and it seamlessly integrates playful entertainment styles. There we go. In the longer chapter, I analysed John Oliver and his show Last Week Tonight as a prime example of media meta-commentary, but here's only one. So many of you probably know the show Last Week Tonight. It's a comedy news show which airs on HBO weekly. There are no guests. Oliver presents alone, delivering narratives. The main meat of it is delivering narratives lasting about 10 or 20 minutes on a particular topic. As a part of his shtick, Oliver claims he's not a journalist, despite the fact that he employs a raft of investigative journalists and hones quite closely to the rules of traditional journalism. But it does mean that the show is not bound by the rules of journalism, and it can follow the newer partisan format in taking unambiguous moral positions in its stories. So Oliver and his show can act in the public interest as they define it, without being held accountable to establish authorities in media or politics. And while Last Week Tonight is certainly not culturally or politically conservative, it's not strictly aligned with party politics either. It offers broader cultural stories as a part of the mix, and it takes aims at lots of different kinds of power holders, from politicians to the World Wrestling Federation to the Miss America beauty pageant, one of my favorites. It takes up topics like drone technology, the power of mega churches, the costs of health insurance, and the system of toxic debt collection. Above all, Last Week Tonight is a comedy news show that is self-consciously performative. The narrative works at the level of comedy, using jokes and gags to hold different elements together. It juxtaposes photographs and videos and verbal elements in rapid intertextual cross-referential array. Consider the opening of an early episode about changes in federal communications policy, originally aired in 2014. Oliver went on to update this net neutrality story several times in the following years, and he created a second long-form narrative on the same topic in 2017. But the first story in 2014 is exemplary of his innovation, and I thought that I might use it because it's quite funny. So in rapid comedic sequence, Oliver makes jokes about coyote urine, connects this to multiple popular cultural references, including widely known memes and a pop star. Viewers may not be familiar with every reference, but they know some of them and are connected to others through Oliver's narrative. I want to suggest first that this strategy invokes a widely based democratic public by narrating a collective representation of different media spaces and different media audiences. It recognizes the porous boundaries between performer and audience member, consumers, users, clients, citizens, beneficiaries, and between public and private. It stitches these fragments together to evoke a wider collective internet space and the public that inhabits it. If people's daily experience in media suggests they live in polarized micro-communities defined by friends and enemies, Oliver's presentation suggests that these communities might really all be joined together in a larger media landscape in which they have a shared interest. This is an important method through which Last Week Tonight sets agendas for mass publics. Second, Oliver's performance particularizes and relativizes other media performances. His first move is to decontextualize other media performances and juxtapose them. This undermines the authority of these performances by arraying them as a set of competing possible interpretations or references to the main story that he's telling. To be sure, these decontextualized performances are still used to ground Oliver's own narrative by establishing facts and evidence about the proposed changes to federal communications policy. But while he borrows the authority of other media experts, he also destabilizes their performative claims to authority. By using less effective formats as a foil, he elevates his own performance as more authentic than those of staid cookie-cutter newscasters that do not really understand the stakes of the issue or the audience they are addressing. For this reason, Oliver's might be understood as a critical, anti-professional mode of expertise. Third, well, maybe it's not third, maybe it's fourth, Oliver uses media references to provide light relief from the central news narrative, which largely relies on official sources. The playful framing of the commentary is actually a way of winking at the audience, acknowledging that news formats are performances. Indeed, that entertainment genres have always informed news performances. This too is a critical reflection on mainstream news and other earnest performances in the public sphere. At the same time that Oliver questions the sincerity of other actors, he represents and elevates his audiences as critical readers of the performative claims of those in authority. As he develops the story, Oliver connects data and stories about federal lobbying by Comcast with references to cable television shows like lizard lick towing, jokes about social life on social media, references to how boring Thomas Friedman's books are, and how annoying children's television is. This is a virtuoso display of media knowledge, and it authorizes Oliver's critical analysis and commentary. Oliver also introduces a new element to the long-standing tradition of media meta-commentary by marshalling internet-using publics to shape political policy about the means of symbolic production themselves. As you may know, in this famous case, He encouraged viewers to flood the FCC website calling for public comments. The FCC reported receiving 3.7 million comments, and the website promptly crashed more than once. There are now nearly 22 million comments on the site on this issue. Finally, Oliver's story continued to unfold over time. 2 weeks after the original story, Oliver broadcast a follow-up story that revisited a joke about Tom Wheeler, the then FCC chairman, and aired a video clip of a C-SPAN reporter asking Wheeler if he had seen John Oliver's story. Wheeler responds slowly at first and then cracks a joke that responds to Oliver. The point is that the story on Oliver's comedy news show unfolds in time, well beyond the original episode, and not only includes millions of internet users acting online to shape the public process of policy review at the Federal Communications Commission, but also the actions of C-SPAN reporters and political principals who now refer to Oliver's jokes to frame their own discussions of policy and political participation. And all this too is reported widely in news and entertainment media. In short, Oliver has altered the media performances of other actors by drawing them into his performance and clearly illuminated that we are all living in a transmedia environment that is a far more complex, connected, and integrated social space than that which is imagined by traditional media models of journalism and politics. So, what can we learn about democracy and the crisis of expertise from John Oliver? Why has he been called the most trusted man in America, which he has by like Time magazine and lots of other people? Well, I want to suggest first that Oliver's hacker-esque style very clearly demonstrates the social instability of conditions of expertise. No one who is connected through the internet is ever unavailable to criticism, it seems, and everyone everywhere is connected to the internet. Oliver uses this fact to hold a range of actors to account in government, business, cultural, and wider media institutions. Second, performance matters. Oliver illuminates the crucial importance of media skill in performing expertise. He never wavers in observing that what he is doing is a performance. He is performing, others are performing, and the conditions of performance are a critical political question. When Oliver deflates the performances of the powerful and their serious, earnest styles, he unmasks the privilege of established cultural power, and that includes the authority of experts. An analysis of Oliver's meta-commentary suggests that authority must be claimed performatively, and it doesn't simply come with the law degree, the PhD, or a fancy title. It suggests further that all experts should become more aware of their positions of privilege in relation to clients and audiences and wider publics. That indeed has been one of the effects of these changes. In this popular vein, Oliver includes his large audience in his performances. The user audience is a key element of his performative fusion and also a key to Oliver's credibility and authenticity. It also suggests why he's been able to marshal network publics to act collectively. His performances recognize the multiple identities and relationships of his audience and then connects them together to represent and invoke a public. This stitching together of networked publics through collective representations of the social are shown to exist in and through the media. That's where they live. Media meta-commentary is interesting, I think, because it successfully resolves underlying tensions between epistemological uncertainty, the challenges of performing expert authority, and the demand for authentic collective narratives that can inform contemporary mediated public spheres. That said, the history of media meta-commentary, especially as it runs through conservative formats, suggests that it is neither inherently progressive nor critical. There is no guarantee that media meta-commentary improves social reflexivity, as some have argued, or that it can resist elite capture and the influence of money and power. So in the end, this brings me back to a very old conclusion about the fundamental importance of independence for media institutions, actors, and processes, and to questions about the conditions for critical media expertise in the new media environment. The question of media independence, I suggest, is central to the ability of all experts to perform their knowledge, for all critics to engage in criticism, and arguably for the constitution of democratic publics.
Thank you very much, Eleanor. So finally, our discussant for this session is Diane Vaughn. Diane Vaughn is a professor in the Department of Sociology here at Columbia, and her research into complex socio-technical systems has yielded a number of books, including The Challenger Launch Decision, and most recently, Dead Reckoning, Air Traffic Control, System Effects, and Risk. Thanks for joining us, Professor Vaughn.
Good afternoon. These papers that were presented are extremely different in the take on the topic and the information that they present. Each one valuable in its own right, but in common, they all look at historical change across time in one way or another, but each project looks at different time levels, time periods, uses different levels of analysis, data, and theoretical framing. All reveal the key role of technology and its effects on institutions and professions. So we get to see not only the innovative of technological and organizations, but also the liabilities of technological and organizational innovation across cases. Sequentially, we get a sweeping picture of the important role of technology, broadly defined here by me as technologies of controlling coordination and control, in addition to our traditional understanding of what technologies are. So, for example, rules and procedures, devices, material objects in reward systems as examples. So I want to bring out the innovation and technologies and how they affect the rest of the analysis of each of the presentations. So Paul Starr begins his presentation by looking at the 3 challenges to professional expertise. And I want to go more, before I get to that, I would like to go more deeply into his analysis of the reason he came to these conclusions and what preceded before. He examines the historical projection of the development of different fields, beginning with late 19th century theories. Sorry, poor visual. Later 19th century theories predicted, starting with late 19th century theories predicted professions and post-industrial societies would grow together, but they had uneven development, and these changes were visible in the mid-20th century. So this variation, the problem of variation led him to ask the question of why do some institutional fields see little professionalization, even though they demand levels of expertise comparable to fields where professional institutions have been established. So he chooses the 2 that he mentions, looking at healthcare professionals as hyper professionals and low professionalism of high tech. The theoretical framing he's using is mainly macro level. He uses institutional theory, and which asks the questions of how do organizations come to look alike? And the answer is institutional isomorphism due to the search for legitimacy in organization fields. So he describes he describes the isomorphic process as it occurred earlier in the healthcare profession as a historic shift in scientific judgment in the late 19th century, and progressive area increases the cultural authority of professions, that healthcare organizations become isomorphic, which means that because of their success and cultural authority, regulatory organizations reinforce the pattern by creating institutional norms and protections for jurisdictional claims and scientific professions. The variation came. The history of technological innovation gave rise to new forms of expertise, the high-tech sector and the online media, each tech sector having organizational flexibility, no common organizational form, no common jurisdictional boundaries, independent entrepreneurs, or as Paul concluded, there's more than one way to organize expertise. But then he goes on with his conclusions that he introduces the project within his presentation today, how mistrust of healthcare even developed as historical process. Technology eroded professional autonomy and authority to emerging corporations, created a healthcare industry with compounded the problem of mistrust and the rise of the radical right. So in response to this penetrating historical analysis, he also makes very strong statements about institutional change and medical school licensing, medical schools and membership in medical societies that are all crucial to the creation of boundaries, separating the legitimate professions from the unqualified. One of the things omitted that I would like to hear him discuss is the examination of the ideas and contributions and ideologies of science itself. Tom Gear wrote in 1983 an article called Boundary Work and the Demarcation of Science from Non-Science, Strengths and Interests in the Professional Ideologies of Scientists, in which he argues that their interests were in status and pursuit of professional goals, and having access to institutional authority and career opportunities. And career opportunities. And in response, scientists attempted to create a public energy to reproduce their public image by continuing to favor science over non-scientific intellectuals and technical activities. That is, they were driven by an ideology to reinforce their prestige, and the activities that they pursued were to carefully distinguish science from non-science. So in considering change now and the effects on technology and professional and autonomy and authority, we will see that in some of the other papers. Frank Pasquale, a very different topic. His central problem is that technology matters in a very different way, and that is how to precisely evaluate the long-term benefits of possible policies of regulation. That is, for example, the effects of minimum wage laws, using the case of U.S. Office of Management in Budget. There is a string of work right now looking at unexpected futures and unbound futures, and the ways that these problems involve because due to classic understandings, beginning with Robert Merton and Robert Jervis on complex systems, making the argument that complex systems will systematically produce unexpected consequences, both positive and negative, and followed up by really the first publication by Barry Turner, an empirical publication, which he titled Failures of Foresight, with the idea that we cannot predict the consequences of complexity in organization. And so, like Paul, Frank's research is comparative, but he foregrounds technology. He compares two technologies for policy evaluation: cost-benefit analysis, entrenched and quantitative, and the more recent technology, scenario analysis, which is narrative and qualitative. The theoretical framing is really meso level for this when looking at organizations and subunits and regulation. A central concept is managerialism and ideology, with emphasis on competition, scarce resources, and market efficiency behind practices and technologies to organize the world along competitively efficient lines. And the idea of focusing on regulation is driven in CBA by emphasizing the costs and ignoring the benefits of regulation in his analysis, directed towards deregulation and conservative the production of and results, in fact, in the production of inequalities in valuation and the deduction of value of human life. And there's power, reinforces the power of technocratic policymakers. He argues that CBA is based on determinacy, when in fact it can't predict because the outcomes are multifactored and indeterminate. One of the considerations here, from my perspective, is the timeliness and the creation of these diagnoses and policies and their implementation, and then their need in terms of responding to unanticipated consequences that have to be met on a short timeline. And that means that regulation lags behind because they're operating on the basis of formal system and formal rules, and have not really been trained how to improvise on those rules to meet certain unprecedented situations like September 11th, wherever, and others. So this is where his advocacy for technological and organizational innovations to increase trust, arguing that which is a non-managerial approach of scenario analysis, the planning tool aimed at uncertainty, multiple possible outcomes to deal with this very complexity and unexpected consequences, and deal with biases by incorporating a variety of expertise in policymaking. And second, another kind of technological innovation he suggests is organizational changes. Conservatives propose to abolish the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, and he suggests to make it a meta agency in an advisory role, which gives it the power to go in different directions. It is, as he said, he goes on to admit in some detail that both fail in very different ways due to contingency and unanticipated consequences, some of it due to time and policy implication and changing society over time. But the liabilities of technological innovation, it's impossible to predict and prepare for all situations. But he also argues for the benefit in that eliminating the conservative bias that goes into scenario analysis by bringing in people with different expertise and different historical production of knowledge backgrounds in other areas will really diversify and sort of depoliticize the scenario analysis and create something that is able to take into account different situations, and that unlike CBA really reflect and take into account the needs of populations and well, so it becomes in effect more democratic. My question is, can it be implemented? Scenario analysis sounds great, and sounds great, and in your paper you talk about you and your co-author had tested it. Has it been tested in real life circumstances, and how does it stack up in terms of the implication of bringing in experts to examine, like, has it really changed? Because everyone brings background biases and prejudice based on cultural understandings that they bring to the situation, whatever the complexity of the situation is, or positive outcomes of perception might be. So I wondered about that. But the other thing I also wondered about the politics carrying over from one paper to the other. What about the rise of the radical right? What are the obstacles? And getting this through and formalized. Also, the Office of Information and whatever it is. So Eleanor, Eleanor's is historical. Eleanor's is historical in the sense that you examine technological innovations in this historical moment as even more recent than what Frank was doing. In this historical moment, and describes a new form of media expertise that has come very quickly. With the birth of John Oliver, I would say, from based on your presentation. Your approach is to frame institutional change in the media and respect for the media, engagement in media, at the micro level, by looking at qualitative analysis and analyzing this case study of John Oliver and last week tonight, then moving from the micro level to data to show the effectiveness of media expertise in the creation of a new media space, which I consider a new organizational form that you equate with the field, in which audiences become actors who have agency in this novel media space. There are several new concepts: the idea of critical media expertise, media meta-commentary, transmedia narrative, and deinstitutionalized expertise. In your interpretive work, you almost give a behind-the-scenes experience, revealing the skills and the processes of media expertise through the one example. But John Oliver is an exotic case that really allows us to see things that we wouldn't see otherwise. He takes his legitimacy following some of the things besides his success, takes the traditional role in journalism of the independent cultural critique and politicians, and takes on politicians, other journalists, or entertainment, and traditional news, performing it, making them seem inauthentic, self-interested, and out of touch. But no one is safe. Conservatives as well as liberals, including himself. Playfulness with serious social criticism is combined. It's like the old song, "A spoonful of sugar makes the medicine down if you make them laugh while you're sticking them in the stomach." It's an amazing, the whole analysis of the net neutrality is an amazing response in the diffusion of his First, it's an amazing response in the diffusion of his ideas by the reactions of those he criticized, who begin responding him in the media or whatever media access they have, who continue his opinions and the discussion. That's helping to create a wider, diverse audience because they spread the news. Unite them, and how that unites this diverse audience in common social concerns and move them to act. The response on net neutrality and shutting down the website, it was just astonishing. I was really shocked to read the percentage. It's the public against government policy, speaking up against government policy. But you end on a very positive note. What we see here is the opposite of the liabilities of technological innovation, the very possibility of democratic advance and increase in trust in the media, which you support by your statements and analysis of the number of young media experts growing up and imitating his stance. And so from that, you conclude the possibility of democratic advance and increased trust. But two things think about the idea of the exotic case. One is, what about the radical press and media in response? Doesn't it seem as if they have imitated like the Fox News leaders, and that this has generated others as well? And what does that mean in the production of news now and written and passing on the performance of John Oliver to others? Is it going to change the impact of the media on policy determination and democratic voice, giving democratic voice to others in the long run? Or is this going to actually build in does it deepen the conflicts that we already have? Thank you.
So we'll give the panelists an opportunity to react if they choose to Professor Vaughn's comments, and then in the remaining time, we'll field questions.
Thank you, Diane, for your comments. I would just add one thing, perhaps. The populist reaction, the populist attack on expertise is highly compartmentalized. It isn't really, I think, a general philosophical attack on experts. It's where expert knowledge relates to questions of power. And it's at that point where their concerns have been aroused. Now, in general, they may not be disposed to respect experts, but they're not really fighting the use of scientific technical knowledge across the whole frontier of social choices that arise. So it's the things that have been thrown into political contention. Those are the areas where this battle has erupted.
Yes, I mean, thanks so much for this really insightful comments, and to try to address your two last challenges, which I think were very important. First, real situations of scenario analysis. I think I would point to a few ideas. One is stress testing in finance, that there is a after the Dodd-Frank Act, there was a requirement for prudential regulators to try to stress test potential scenarios that could lead to bad outcomes. I mean, ironically, though, with Silicon Valley Bank, one of the things they did not stress test was a sudden increase in interest rates. So, so this does make you feel like, oh no, that's a real problem, right? Hopefully, though, we learn, right? We learn that that's something, and I think I think that the advocates of CBA could say, well, we've learned about the fragility of willingness to pay models of CARMs, and we've learned about all these other things, and that we're advancing. And I think we could advance the scenario analysis. I think also, war gaming, red teaming, and security. Those are all the places where the paper would be stronger if it got into some more concrete detail on exactly those types of issues. With respect to, and this is, I think something that the radical right challenge, right? I think that if both political parties had been constrained by CBA in a symmetrical way, I'd be very cautious about either relegating the OIRA to a purely advisory role, or to radically expanding the types of relevant methodological expertise with respect to policy evaluation. But as Elizabeth Pop Berman has observed, actually, it seems that the CBA is much more likely constrained Democratic administrations than Republican ones. And so, and she is, and I helped organize I was part of a symposium on her book, and I sort of wrote a response to her book, sort of really praising it for that fact, for that reason, because that in turn led me to help to try to figure out, well, if the quantitative methods only seem to really be constraining one side of the political spectrum very often, then maybe we need to open things up so that there's a little bit less constraint in the area. But I do think you're right to say that that's a very powerful that has to be acknowledged squarely in the paper. So, thanks.
So Frank, I was surprised that you're calling for more scenario analysis, because I guess I've always identified that with Herman Kahn, the RAND, the Hudson Institute, and with the CIA's plan, it was Group B or whatever, and they produced a lot of inflated estimates about Russian, about Soviet arms, and so when I think back on that, I could think about all kinds of ways that could be used that would be quite dangerous. And so I guess why should we hold out a higher hope for scenario analysis? By the way, you mentioned stress test, but that was quantitative, right? So I don't know that that's a good example of an alternative.
I mean, I don't know if it's such. I mean, I think that they were. Yeah, one of the things that I think is critical here is to sort of think about perhaps scenario analysis as being something that could encompass CBA, but it doesn't end. CBA isn't the be all and end all, right? So, I mean, I do think that your challenge here could push me back to Amy Sinden's advocacy for informal cost benefit analysis, which is about giving a list of costs, giving a list of benefits, but not trying to quantify them and not trying to add all that up, right? So I guess the idea would be that perhaps in that light, but I guess I still really want to explore scenario analysis, because I feel like where I'm seeing a lot of very interesting and powerful scenario analysis is in areas like climate change, right? And I think that right now they're experimenting. It seems as though very often the acceptable levels of potential risk or danger within, say, the economics profession, narrowly speaking, always seem to be somewhat behind the actual levels of risk and danger, or at least are somewhat or substantially behind. So I guess it really does. I suppose that maybe where I'm going with this, and this comes to actually I think is relevant to the latest issue of the American Prospect, has this terrific set of articles on modeling and critiques of modeling.
God,
right?
I was going to plug that. I can imagine. Wow.
So of course I had to plug this, right? So I mean they're wonderful, and they're terrific articles by Phil Rocco and Rakeem Mahmood and George Stiglitz. It's incredible, and I think part of why they are
not George Stiglitz.
Which Stiglitz?
Joe Stiglitz.
Joe Stiglitz. I'm sorry, Joe Stiglitz. Sorry about that. So they are doing, I think, the reason why they're doing it, I think, is because they're worried about progressives, I think, being too prematurely hemmed in by many of these tools of the Congressional Budget Office, OIRA, et cetera. And I think that's in terms of the ideological valence here, that's how I would respond, is that I feel like it seems like even in your publication, you've got folks, lots of folks who are worried that, these existing quantitative models are hemming in necessary progressive policy.
The provocation that everybody weigh in as well, I thought was a particularly interesting one. So thank you very much for the close read, Diane. And I am not sure I 100% agree that I am as optimistic as you paint me. I think that the claim in some ways is that all of these expert claims, all of the things that we imagine that we're doing, including modeling and scenario analysis, are in fact already and have already been occurring in a much more complex and interconnected media environment than most people took account of at the time. And so, for example, when one asks about the impact of the media on political outcomes, it sort of assumes that somehow the media are outside the political field, or that the political field proper is outside the media field. And I think to some degree, the argument is that these distinctions become harder and harder to actually make, not just because when we say media and politics, we're often thinking about journalism and news, narrowly speaking, right? Instead of a much larger media field that includes collective representations at the inside of the White House from West Wing, or expectations about how political principles will perform their expertise in times of crisis, but also that larger democratic publics and questions of trust are as affective and emotional as they are technical and sort of instrumental and rational. And so in some ways, the argument is about how one then has to perform expertise in this more complex space, and how in some ways everybody has already always been doing that performance, including this performance. And so I think in some ways that's more the argument trying to be made, I guess I would say. On the question of conservative precursors, I might even argue that Rush Limbaugh invented media meta commentary. Certainly Oliver is a latecomer to the game, and in earlier work, I have a piece called Hermeneutics of Hannity, so spent quite a lot of time, unfortunately, listening to Sean Hannity back in the day. But this is part of a history that tries to make the argument that its forms are very much continuous with the larger aesthetic discourse of the independent critic that runs alongside modernity. And critics, to be sure, and particularly cultural critics, make their claim, right, by showing behind the curtain, right, the stagecraft, the mechanics of performance, right, the politician kissing the baby as actually being self-interested and so forth, right. The critics themselves are also performing, right, and so this introduces these dynamics of performance and counter-performance over time, so that Oliver is running a very long line, right? So the development of policy is absolutely central and corrosive in this respect, but it spawned a similar set of discussions on cable TV, Rachel Maddow, John Stewart. I mean, the list sort of goes on, and all of these aesthetics and styles have panned out now into network television across multiple other kinds of genres. So I think where in the past one might have expected, under the fairness structure, both sides of the story as though there are only the two. Now, in some ways, those feedback effects and those critical loops, we would be looking for them at the level of I call it the media ecology, but it's another specious metaphor, at the level of the entire media system itself, which is increasingly, right, encompassing other systems. And a final note, and I cut this because it's a short talk, but I would also make the argument that in our understandings of science and of politics, we favour a dismissal of the media field as somehow less serious and trivial and less rational and less pure. And I'm going to suggest that that may not serve us in the current environment, and that we might need to take the media field and its players as social objects just as seriously as us.
I'll call on people who have questions, and we have a question from Harry.
Everyone, and response to your remark. This question, yeah, is that right? Yeah. This question responds to your remark, Paul, that the radical right are interested in combating expertise only when it's a matter of power. And I must admit, I've seen it as something far more general than that. So I just want to check how you interpret, shall we say, the argument over the size of Trump's inaugural crowd.
Well, that wasn't about experts, was it? It was about, it was about Trump's also, it's about Trump's inflated conception of himself.
No, it was about experts. It's about whether you count you warrant the size of the inaugural crowd by what Trump and Kellyanne Conway say, or by somebody who's taken a photograph of it where you can count up the numbers of people on it who are experts.
I don't know. I don't think that particularly contradicts. I'm sure you could come up with examples that do contradict what I said, because I wasn't making a statement that was saying this is the only way that the populist right enters into this. But these are primarily questions of power, and they're not. I don't think they're not generally interested in disputing technical expertise in building bridges or anything. I mean, it's highly selective.
Bryce first. And should we collect a couple of questions? Okay, then we'll have Gil after Bryce.
Thanks a lot. I had a question for Frank. I was very interested by the talk, but I was wondering whether the discussion you're proposing to have about how to refine cost benefit analysis, integrating more things, integrating non-quantitative elements. I mean, there is another way of seeing that, right? It's a way in which what is at stake is how to rethink evaluation itself, right? Not as something whose mission is to describe the world as it is, as a set of objective facts for policymakers to take the good decisions, but as something that opens up space for politics, for instance, making explicit various choices, making it possible to explore particular policy options. And then we get a political construct in which evaluation is not about objective facts as if it was opposed to subjective decision-making, but as something that is more exploratory, so to speak.
And Gil was next. Yeah, we'll do.
Actually, that's perfect because I have a question for Paul and for Eleanor, so that will complete the three. For Paul, so I thought you were going somewhere else when you said that you're going to use your comparison of healthcare and high tech, and also talk about the mistrust of experts. And what I thought you were going to talk about perhaps is how the high tech sector is different, because it can become a hotbed of mistrust of experts. That it's, yes, I mean, we mistrust Facebook deeply, but this whole sector, because it is, its model of organization is completely different. If you're not emphasizing professionalism, you're emphasizing results. And when you're emphasizing results, you can easily sort of swing towards a critique of forms of expertise. So I want, that's not so much a question, it's an observation, but I'm sure you can comment on that. And to Eleanor, so I wonder if you can comment on what I found as a strange contrast between your paper and Summerson. Yeah, Summerson's paper, in the first session. Because in Summerson's paper, you have Americans so resistant to be led by experts that the expert had to play the role of a non-expert. And yet it seems, or maybe I'm wrong, and you can correct me on that, it seems here we are clamoring to be led by an expert, in this case, a meta-commentator, but perhaps he's also performing some form of an expertise. I don't know. So, but in that case, people will play the role of their armies, the army of trolls of John Oliver and write to the FCC, etc. So I was wondering if there's any analogy, or on the contrary, a contrast.
Right, why don't you go first?
Oh, sure. Got something. Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate that question, because I think that it is the idea of rethinking evaluation itself, and what are we trying to do when we evaluate a policy and when we try to predict its future effects. And it's I think part of why I went into this as well is because there are these estimates about, say, the amount of money that the US will spend on healthcare that sort of sometimes try to extrapolate it out to say by 2100 it'll be 80% of GDP or something. And I'm just saying that's not plausible, right? That's at some point that will not keep going. And I think in rethinking evaluation itself, I think part of what you're calling on us to do, and what I'm going to try to rethink in revising the paper, is what are the functions of evaluation, right? What are we doing? And I think that very often, I think we're trying to give, it's difficult to say that you can, like a judge looking at a legal case, decide whether the plaintiff or defendant wins, whether one side has more costs than benefits. What you're really trying to do is figure out, say, is there a world in which this policy is going to make a lot of sense and a world in which it makes very little sense? And I really like that idea of opening up the idea of evaluation itself. So thank you. Yeah, very generative.
So Gil, you've provoked me to think more about this. I'm sure a lot more could be said about the differences between mistrust in the tech industry and mistrust in healthcare. So here's one. The right-wing distrust of the tech platforms does not arise from the fact that they're businesses, from the fact that they have commercial interests. It arises from their belief that there are liberals in these organizations who are twisting the organizations so as to disadvantage conservatives in the distribution of opinion and so forth, to silence them. The distrust about healthcare these days, which is not just coming from the left, but I think actually, is fairly widespread, does have to do with the commercial interests in the enterprise and a concern about insurance companies and so forth, that are, and pharmaceutical companies and many others that have abused the public. I was just have to mention this subject of the American Prospect. This is the magazine that I co-founded and co-edited, and we're doing a special issue about healthcare, and one of the journalists who's going to be involved said, he said the problem with writing about healthcare is that there haven't been enough crime reporters on the beat. So this is the suspicion that there's corruption of a kind that has really taken advantage of
The healthcare was right.
Go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. I love the motivational interviewing paper. Loved it. I don't know if Simpson's still here. Yep. Hello. Absolutely loved it. There's lots of ways it's clearly not the same sort of situation. I mean, this is a therapeutic space. Ponytail John was sent there because he failed a drug test. That's not why I turn on the television. So, I mean, I think that, situationally, these are really quite different. And I enjoyed the question about whether or not it was a synecdoche for democracy. So the issue that gets taken up there has to do with autonomy. And, people are interested in the cultural fields and, scientific are obsessed with autonomy, right? Like this is a through line of those of us who are interested in intellectuals and intellectual fields. And so in some ways, motivational interviewing sort of deceptively allows the respondent to think that they're retaining their autonomy while they're coming to their own conclusion. Like that's the whole sort of shtick. John Oliver, and I mean, really, he's just an exemplar. There are so many folk who are doing this now. It's a media format more than anything else. Is basically saying, I'm one of you, right? So it's a representative move in an environment where it's really hard to make a successful representative move. Extremely difficult to sustain collective representation in the current moment. And so that's a different sort of, that's not a challenge to autonomy. They're not saying lead us. He's like, I'm not leading anybody. I mean, you see, they absolutely refuse that role, all of them. They just say, I'm just like a TV personality. This is ridiculous, right? Politics exists in other places, in other spaces. You're over elevating this, right? But by the same token, the thing they are doing is creating some kind of collective representation that we are all connected to. And the only thing in some ways that we are all connected to, right, are these things. Overlapping, intermittent, uneven, mosaic, problematic, but we're connected. And so the ability to represent that, I think, shouldn't be taken for granted. And I think most expert claims to authority function partly because the performative condition in solid modernity was that institutional context stayed stable and lined up with all of your other statuses and roles. And once that starts to disassemble, it's difficult to reassemble.
So I saw a hand toward the back. Yes.
Yes, a question for Professor Townsley. It's been told that a lot of young people only get the news through John Oliver and late night shows. And
Instagram, TikTok.
what do you think that does to the attitude? And as we go, when you said the most trusted person in America, it came back to me like, what would have been in the 60s or 70s? It would have been probably Walter Cronkite.
That's right.
So when we go from Walter Cronkite to John Oliver, what does that do to the attitude towards news, the consumption news, and the reaction? Because you have a completely different type of coverage this way. So I was curious if you had any thoughts on that.
Oh, yes, lots of them. I have two daughters in college, and I can tell you that they are surprisingly well informed, but most of it, I think, is coming from TikTok, Instagram, and various other sort of online sites that I probably don't know about. So a couple of things are really clear. Media environment is densely connected, which means half of the things they're getting on TikTok actually originally came from New York Times articles, right? So that's one of the issues. They're getting a lot of the same news I'm getting. They're getting it in different formats. So it depends what you mean by news, right? There's content, there's formats, there's aesthetic styles, that kind of thing. I'm partly more interested in whether or not they can tell a bogus statement from one that's not bogus. So one of the observations about the current media landscape, right, is that there's a diffusion of aesthetic styles such that anti-vaxxers and climate deniers are using all of the same performances as mainstream science and look very persuasive with charts and graphs, and people can't necessarily tell the difference. So it's not so much where they're getting it from or who they're getting it from, it's can they assess that information and what does that information look like? So that's one kind of set of issues. The second set of issues actually has to do with how the development of that media ecology has shifted, for example, how news gets produced and sort of what stories and such get covered. And there sort of seems to me to be two directions there. One is there's been an enormous narrowing in the number of stories that are seriously covered in sort of core legacy media, and they get repurposed a great deal and inflected and commented upon and so forth. And so massive loss of, say, foreign news offices over time, many fewer things covered over time, lower down in the system, fewer reporters, fewer people on crime beat, for example, in general. So that I think is highly problematic. Then you have this proliferation of new and small communities. So it's a bit of a chaos and a riot, but I don't think that the sort of core model is, I think it's taken a bruising, but it's still there. And I'm not sure, I think the question of where they're getting it and what they're getting are somewhat distinct, if that's reasonable.
So let me just also respond to that question. You can't compare Walter Cronkite and John Oliver, because in the 1960s and 1970s, there were 3 networks. They had news broadcast national news pretty much at the same time. On any given night, about 1/4 of the American public was watching one of those 3 largely interchangeable shows. There was a high degree of consensus about what was national news. There's nothing like that today. John Oliver's audience is a tiny fraction of what Walter Cronkite's was. And today's experience, and people could talk, you talk about Instagram or whatever, people have totally different experiences in these media. They're seeing and hearing completely different things. It's not one thing, the way television news was in half a century ago. And so you can have drastically different versions of reality among different people, whereas there was a high degree of coordination about what constituted news, about what constituted fact at that time.
Andy.
Yeah, so my question is for Frank, and it's about your suggestion that we shift from or extend from cost benefit analysis to scenario analysis and doing evaluation of policy. And I guess my question jumps off from thinking about how and why cost benefit analysis has cultural authority. And this is based on Ted Porter's work, for example, on public trust in numbers. And so it's through quantification agencies are able to generate the legitimacy of their policy decisions. So I guess my question is how you see particular scenarios becoming able to generate authority, and especially in a world in which there are many possible kinds of scenarios that could be presented. So how does one choose which scenario to trust in or to accept as the right scenario to use in assessing a given policy?
Great. And this is one where I'll give you a very I'll give you a few examples of where, because it is complicated to sort of say, like, I mean, I think you're absolutely right to say it. I mean, certainly, there's exemplary work on the cultural authority behind numbers and quantification represented here and elsewhere. And to give a few examples, I think that the one thing that Amy Sinden has done is she's done for the Hastings Center a sort of like sketch of a scenario analysis of what does American lead regulation policy look like, either based on the accepted toxicity data that was around, say, in the 20s and 30s about lead and gasoline and lead being put out in the air versus sort of like different scenario analysis that could have been done at the time about the effect of lead. Of course, now we know that like the US was an outlier in terms of letting lead pollute and poison our citizens for many decades beyond what much of the rest of the world did. And one of the things that what Sinden says is that it was relatively easy for the US to go down this path when, to the extent that there were demands for quantified demonstration of toxic effects of lead, as opposed to what could have been foreseen perhaps in a looser epistemic environment or a more inclusive, broader. And I'm still playing with the metaphors here. I also think that I'm inspired by Richard H. Brown's work in A Poetic for Sociology, where in that work he actually says that some of the criteria, there are categories, say, of plausibility and reflection of important values in scenarios. So a very implausible scenario is going to be less powerful, I think, that is less powerful than a plausible one. There's also a criteria of adequacy such as economy, originality, perspicacity, concinnity, elegance, cogency, and form. So I think we might borrow some terms from literary analysis, what makes a convincing story versus a convincing narrative versus an unconvincing one. And to give one almost comical, but I mean certainly tragicomical example, it was reported by Jane Meyer at one point that the Koch brothers had in their hall, that they sponsored the Hall of Human Origins, I think in some museum. And they had a scenario that they put forward that said, maybe global warming isn't going to be so, or at least that this museum put forward as an experimental thought was like, maybe climate change won't be so bad because humans will evolve to be shorter, have curved spines, and live underground. Okay, right. Now, if someone tried to write up a scenario, and there actually is a serious NYU bioethicist who talked about the moral imperative for people to become smaller, to have a smaller ecological footprint, et cetera. All I want to say there is like, that's a really implausible, bizarre scenario that doesn't reflect human values, right? That doesn't reflect a lot of values, like important values. And I think that I think part of this is like in academic context, I think we're familiar with evaluative, like think about Michel Lamont's work on how professors think. We're familiar with an idea that like, we decide who to give tenure to, we're going to get like 10 letters, 5, 10, 15 letters from others that are not necessarily going to be just about how many citations the person has. In fact, that might be, relatively low on the list of criteria, but they're going to try to qualitatively assess how qualified the person is. So I think if we can borrow from some of these areas, like what Richard H. Brown borrows from, and I think Richard H. Brown is really consonant with the work of like interpretive social science in general, people like Geertz and Rabinow and others. If we can do that, if we can look at some of our existing practices of non-quantitative evaluations and what are, say, more or less convincing tenure letters or other letters of recommendation, et cetera, that I think there are ways of doing this. But I do agree with you that, like, yeah, well, the problem I think is that a lot of the authority of quantification comes from a false determinacy. It's not a real determinacy. When they estimate, for example, there are 100, probably, I shouldn't say 100, but I know there's many, many studies about if you raise the minimum wage, will the number of jobs go down, right? Economists are all over the map on that. I know that many in this room have probably heard of Kruger and Card and think it's a subtle issue, but then there are other studies that say, well, what about this particular issue, this particular site, et cetera. So I feel like once we become comfortable with and familiar with the uncertainty of the quantitative world, then I think we are more confident and better able to try to rebuild concepts of discernment within the qualitative world.
Should we wrap it up? Okay, so I just want to close very briefly. There's no way to pull everything together extemporaneously into a neat bow, but I'm really struck by the convergences and intersections among the talks and the comments. It gives us quite a bit to talk about at the debrief tomorrow. Just on a brief inventory, we've heard about how there's not just one crisis of expertise, but rather crises of expertise, or maybe more precisely that crises of expertise are varied and internally differentiated, that scientific knowledge in particular can be politicized in a number of different ways, that data do not speak for themselves, and the way they're deployed can have all manner of ironic and unintended consequences. We heard about strategies that experts can deploy and stances that they can take to guard themselves against assaults on their authority. And we even heard some attempts to think through how we might adjudicate among the various contenders for the status of expert. So those are some themes that we can talk about in an ongoing manner. But to close this session for today, I just want to thank, first of all, the audience, those of you who showed up to come to the talks, both in person and remotely. And then also I want to thank again, Christian and the other staff members who made today possible. If you're coming to the dinner and you have questions about it, come to me and Gil. But thank you all for coming, and it's good to see you.